Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. So today we're going to be talking about the updates on basically birthright citizenship. USA has put out an implementation plan, basically saying this is how we would eventually apply our rule on birthright citizenship. And if they implemented the way they are, a lot of people are not going to be able to automatically become citizens. So I'll be breaking down what the implementation plan is and how it will affect birthright citizenship moving forward. Because again, the whole point of the birthright citizenship issues is that they want to limit who can actually become a US citizen automatically. If they can limit who can become a US citizen, that means less people are able to automatically become US citizens. And if you are here in the US undocumented, you may end up not being able to have that birthright citizenship for your children. Okay. So it is very important that people know the difference. If you are joining me live and you have questions, feel free to put it in the comments. I will get to it later on. So you can hear me on Instagram. I feel like I have this issue at least once. Okay, so you are not hearing me. I'm just going to change some settings on the Instagram of it all and just hope that you can hear me. All right. So let me know if you can hear me now. Hopefully you can. But the birthright citizenship, there's going to be new implementations. I am going to be sharing my screen on YouTube. So if you want to go over there, you can actually see the screen. If not, I will be telling you exactly what's on the screen. So no worries there. So this is the implementation plan. They actually put this out on July 25th, but I wanted to take some time, digest it before I come on here and talk about it. The implementation plan is basically them implementing Executive Order 14160, which is the protection, the meaning, and value of American citizenship. That is an executive order that was entered by the current president, Trump, and it was entered on January 20th of 2025. So this is how they plan to implement birthright citizenship, limitations on birthright citizenship. So the first thing is to who is subject to this and will no longer be US citizens at birth. This is really important. So the children that will no longer be, let me see if I can make this tiny bit bigger for you guys. So children whose mother was unlawfully present in the US and the father was not a US citizen or lawful permanent resident at the time of the person's birth, and children whose mother's presence in the US at the time of the person's birth was lawful but temporary, such as but not limited to visiting the US under the auspice of the visa waiver program or visiting on a student work tourist visa. And the father was not a United States citizen, lawful permanent resident at the time of the said person's birth. So if the mother, to break all of that down, right? If the mother is not in the US lawfully and the father is not a US citizen or permanent resident, then the child would not be automatically a US citizen. So that's the first one. So if the mother is unlawfully present in the US and the father is not a US citizen or lawful permanent resident, regardless if the father has lawful status in the US or is lawfully present in the US. As long as they are not a US citizen or permanent resident, if the mother is also unlawfully present, that child would not automatically be a US citizen. Okay. The second one is if the mother is present in the US, even if it's lawful presence. So if they're here on a non-immigrant visa, that's what this is saying. If you are here on a non-immigrant visa and the father of the child is not a US citizen or a permanent resident, regardless of if they're also here on a non-immigrant visa, that child would not automatically be a US citizen. Okay. So those are the two situations where a child that is born in the US would not automatically be a US citizen if they're able to implement their whole birthright citizenship limitations. Okay. Right now, so before anyone gets scared and it's like, oh my goodness, when does this go into effect? It doesn't. Okay. It's not going into effect anytime soon because there's an injunction. So a judge already stopped this from becoming the rule of the land. So basically, there is an injunction, and they know there is one. That's the insidious part of this. So basically, they're saying over here, currently, a preliminary injunction is in place preventing the government from implementing this executive order. So they know they can't actually implement this, but they have their plans ready to go just in case their appeal to the Supreme Court ends up in their favor and the Supreme Court rules that the president can end birthright citizenship with just a stroke of a pen, which, if any legal scholars are out there, that is not how constitutional amendments work. Okay. The president cannot just take away constitutional rights with an executive order. They need to basically go through Congress and have a constitutional amendment. Yeah. Executive order is kind of just a brief thing, right? It's implementing a power that the executive branch already has. This is not a power that the executive branch already has, but they want to prepare just in case they can convince enough justices that the president can do this and take away birthright citizenship with just executive order. So this is how they plan on implementing this. So basically, they're saying there's a preliminary injunction in place, but they are going to prepare to implement the executive order in the event that it is permitted to go into effect. Okay? They're going to have this implementation plan just in case they can get that to go into effect. So let's break it down even more. So basically, they're saying if the mother does not have permanent residency or is not a US citizen and is not lawfully present in the US, right? That's what this is saying. If the mother is not lawfully present in the US and the father is not a US citizen or permanent resident, the child is not a US citizen. If the mother is present in the US, even if it's lawful, but they're on a non-immigrant visa, and the father is not a US citizen or permanent resident, then the child is also not a US citizen. Now, one thing I don't here, which I'm assuming, is what if the mother is here on a non-immigrant visa, father a US citizen? Would the child automatically become a US citizen? I'm guessing the answer to that is a bit yes. But what if the father is a lawful permanent resident? So the mother is here on a non-immigrant visa, but the father is a lawful permanent resident. Does the child automatically also become a US citizen? Based on the language here, that seems to be what it should be. Again, based on the language here, there's only two situations saying that the child does not automatically become a US citizen. Okay. Now, they do go into the meaning of lawfully present versus lawful status. It is two different things, And I am a bit glad that they covered that, because when you are lawfully present versus a lawful status can be two different things. So they do go here and say that the term unlawfully present, all right, means an alien present in the United States after expiration of their period of stay. So basically, if you had a visa to the US and your period of stay has expired, you are now unlawfully present. If you were paroled into the US, but your period of stay has expired under that parole, you are now unlawfully present. Um, and then also, if you entered the US without documentation, so you entered EWI, you are also unlawfully present. So, really important to note that there is a difference between unlawful status and unlawfully present. Okay. So, the example they give here is an undocumented person that is actually no, a non-citizen that is paroled into the US have no lawful immigration status, but they are not unlawfully present. So if you're coming with a parole, you do not have any status in the US, but you are also not unlawfully present in the US because US gave you permission to come in. Okay, so that is really the difference there, is that US is giving you permission to be in the US. So for that reason, right, just for that reason, you are lawfully present, but because it's parole, you are unlawful status. So those two are not the same thing. And I am glad they covered that, because um, that would eventually become a problem. Okay. So basically, what we're going to be seeing with this whole thing, right? What we're going to be seeing with USCIS, if, okay, the key here is if they are allowed to move forward with limiting birthright citizenship, this is how they plan on doing it. This doesn't mean that they are limiting it today. Okay, if you have a child in the US today, your child is a US citizen, regardless of your status. Okay, that's what they're trying to change. That doesn't mean that's the case today. Okay, your child is a US citizen if they are born in the US. Now, because this lawsuit's going on, depending on the final outcome of the lawsuit, it's going to determine if they can actually implement this executive order. All right. Want to make that very clear. They cannot implement the executive order unless a judge says they can. And their hope is that that judge would, the court that will make that final decision will most likely be the Supreme Court of the United States. And the administration is hoping that the Supreme Court will keep ruling in their favor. But when it comes to constitutional amendments, I just want to remind people, in order to change things in the Constitution, it requires Congress. Okay, it's not like 50% of Congress, 50% of Congress has to say yes. It requires 2/3. Okay, it's a whole process to get a constitutional amendment. And this administration may not have the political power to get that done with everything going on with Congress at the moment. So they're trying to use an executive order to make that easier for them and make it possible for them to then go ahead and issue this and implement the limitations they want to do. Okay, so that is all the update I have for you. Case is still pending. There's no decision yet. The US government cannot implement their limitations of birthright citizenship, but at least we know what they want to do, right? They already gave us their game plan of who would no longer be automatically a US citizen, so that we know what their plans are ahead of time. But they cannot implement any of that plan until they win in court. And hopefully They do not. Okay. Hopefully the Supreme Court chooses to protect the Constitution. Okay. All right. So remember, if you are joining me live and you have questions, it can be about this topic or any other immigration topic, please put them in the comments. I already see questions, so I'm going to answer those first, but please ask me questions. He's asking which way is better to respond to an RFE between mail-in or upload in the USCIS online account. It really depends on what they're asking for. So, for example, if they're asking for a medical report that is in a sealed envelope, you need to mail that in along with all your other things that they request. Okay. If it is things that are just documentation, they're not asking for originals of any documents, you can upload it. Uploading it means it gets to them immediately, and you can basically see on your My USCIS online account that they have received your response to the request for evidence, and that closes it out. So that's there's not really one way that's better than the other. It's just what is your preference. Okay. So online account, we only really use that if no original documents need to go in with the response to the request for evidence. If they are requesting original documents, we need to put that in the mail and make sure that they have originals. If it's a medical exam that they're requesting, that needs to go in the mail because the medical exam needs to be in a sealed envelope. So there's no way for you to upload the medical exam if it's in a sealed envelope and must be delivered in a sealed envelope. And I should also mention that if they request, let's say, for example, they're requesting the medical exam in a sealed envelope, they're maybe also requesting like a copy of some other documentation that you can just upload. Please do yourself a favor and just send everything together with the medical exam. Because the second that you go to your CIS online account, you click on respond to the request for evidence, you upload your documentation for that, it closes out the request for evidence. It basically says you have responded, and whatever you respond with is what they're going to use to make a decision. So if they're asking for the medical exam and you go and upload everything else, before they get the medical exam, you are going to be in a position where they could legally deny your application because you did not submit everything that they asked you for. Okay. All right. Lilian, my EAD, employment authorization document C9, meaning it was based on marriage family petition, was outside of normal processing time. I did a case inquiry yesterday. How soon before USCIS replies to the inquiry will a decision of my case, or they're going to reply still looking into it? So when you do a service request, USCIS can respond with just going ahead and approving the case if if there's not really anything holding up the process, or if they already have the file in front of an adjudicator. Okay, if they have it in file in front of an officer, they can go ahead and approve it. However, more likely than not, you are going to get an email probably a couple weeks to a month from when you do that request, letting you know that they received your request and giving you a response. And that response can be, we're still working on your case, right? We're still doing, we don't need anything from you at the moment. We'll get back to you if we need anything else. That could be the response. And in response, you may want to look into whether you have a reason for expediting the case or reaching out to a person for help. These are things that you can do in addition to the service request with USCIS. Okay. Next question. Do you think if I upload an evidence to my online account, look at my I-485 application about that evidence and make a decision? It's been 6 months, no action taken yet. Is it a good idea? So when your case is pending, there's a processing time. Just because you upload unsolicited evidence to that case, meaning they didn't ask you to send them the documentation, and you are giving them the documentation unsolicited, does not mean they are all of a sudden going to focus on your case. It will just be in file. Okay. So it's like you give them the unsolicited evidence, they just put it in your file so that when an officer is assigned to your case, when they're ready to actually look at your file, that evidence is in there. It does not prompt them to actually look at your file. Okay. The only time evidence makes them look at your file is if they sent you a request for evidence and you respond to that request for evidence, or they sent you a notice of intent to deny and you respond to that notice of intent to deny. I can tell you that green card applications, family-based green card applications are taking about a year to a year and a half in most places. So if you are 6 months in, there's not going to be an action taken on your case. The last action probably was your biometrics appointment, if you had one, right? If they required you to go in for biometrics, that's going to be the last action most people see on their case before there's a request for evidence, or there's an interview scheduled, or there's a decision on the case. So you are going to see that, oh, they're processing my case today, right? And sometimes you can see that, cases being reviewed does not mean that it's in front of an officer at that moment. Okay. It just means they may have transferred it to a different location. All right. Next question. How long does it take for USCIS to make a decision after receiving an RFE? So this is going to, again, depend on the case and if the case is still within normal processing time. Okay. So I have had situations where they sent a request for evidence very early on in the case, and we sent it in, and it was still the normal processing time, right? I have had cases where they sent it later on in the process, and we responded, and they made the decision like a week or two later. So there's not really a way of knowing where your case is, that spectrum, right? So it could be that it's been months and you're close to the normal processing time being over, and the officer is just looking for that one document or that one thing to make a final decision on the case, and that's why they sent you the request for evidence. But it could also be that the case is at the service center and they're just doing like an initial review to make sure that they have everything they need before they send it off to an officer. And they notice that there's a document missing, they request that document from you, and when you give it to them, then they can basically say, okay, this file is complete and can be put in queue to get to an officer eventually. So unfortunately, I do not have an answer to this particular question. The answer is it depends, right? It depends on where your case is at and if it's actually in front of an officer, if it's been assigned to an officer. There's so many different layers to it. Okay. All right. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to put them in the comments. I do not see any questions on Instagram. Perfect. But I believe those are all the questions I have received. So remember, one thing you need to take away is nothing else, right? If absolutely nothing else, take away that birthright citizenship is still a thing, right? If you have a child in the US, regardless of your immigration status, your child is a US citizen. There's an injunction stopping USCIS from basically saying that you are not able to have a child in the US and that child becomes automatically a US citizen. They know there's an injunction in place. However, they also have decided to put out this implementation plan on how they're going to limit birthright citizenship in the future. Once a court decides that they can, the president has the power to end a constitutional right with an executive order, right? Instead of a constitutional amendment. So they are basically limiting it to, really important to know that it's not just anyone in the US. So if the mother is unlawfully present, meaning that they do not have um, any lawful authority to be in the US, right? Lawful authority is like parole. If you're on parole, you have lawful authority to be in the US. So if they are unlawfully present in the US and the father is not a US citizen or a permanent resident, the child would not be a US citizen at birth, right? If the mother is present in the US, but only on a non-immigrant visa, and the father is not a US citizen or permanent resident, that child would also not be a US citizen automatically. So that is the implementation plan. Now they're trying to figure out, part of this is they're saying they will eventually, as part of their implementation, figure out how, if let's say, for example, the mother is here on a student visa, how the child, like creating a process for that child to gain a status based on the mother's status or based on the father's status that is not a US citizen or permanent resident, right? So it is so important that we keep an eye on this, because again, if they're already telling us how they plan on implementing this, we need to pay attention to it. That's why I'm bringing it to you, because birthright citizenship is still a thing, but they are already planning and plotting the ways that they're going to take it away, right? Once the court says president can do this with an executive order, they already have a plan of how they're going to start implementing this. So seriously, don't worry about it until it becomes law. So if it becomes, if court says, yes, the president can do this, I will bring that to you. But until then, we know what their plans are, and we can be hopeful that the Constitution will be upheld, right? So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments, even if you're watching this on a replay. If you would like to schedule a private consultation with me, you can do that by going to my website, lilylegal.com, click on contact us, and you can pick a time for both of us to talk about your situation and see the best way that I can assist you. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next week. Bye.